So welcome to the first Q&A of this retreat. You're welcome to ask any questions you'd like regarding the practice, regarding the suttas, whatever it may be.
Hi, Delson.
Hey, Bob.
I have a question. I
Yeah.
have a question about meditating while sick because I haven't seen anything on the website about it. And I got a cold a few days ago. And so I didn't, I have taken a little bit of medicine, like cough syrup and that sort of thing. And I've still been meditating. But I just wondered, what if you have any general advice about meditating under that situation?
Yeah, I came across, I think it was in the Samyutta Nikaya, regarding the seven enlightenment factors. And there were a couple of suttas I saw where there was this monk who was sick, and the Buddha gave him a discourse on the seven enlightenment factors. And so he practiced those and he became well again. And in another sutta, it was the Buddha who was sick, and another monk who gave a discourse on the seven enlightenment factors, and the Buddha roused them up, and then he felt much better. So I think there might be something to that. See where your mind is, see how the body's feeling energy wise. It's really important to get some rest. It's really important to be more aware of how the body is feeling. And if you feel lethargic, if you need to take a nap, you should do that. Do all the stuff that you have to do to recover. And while doing that, still be in a meditative state. As Bhante says, if you can smile, you can meditate. So if you can, if you can radiate loving kindness, if you can radiate compassion while you're taking a medicine, while you're just taking it easy, do that, because you can still meditate while you're not feeling well. And in times when, there are where the body feels too stuffy and it's just difficult to do anything, then that's the time to relax and rest and continue just with your awareness of whatever Brahma Vihara or your awareness of the quiet mind.
Okay. Thank you, Bud. Thank you, Delson.
Hi, Delson. I was just wondering that if you can share some light into the Dhammapada that we read in the morning, that in the unessential, we imagine the essential. In the essential, we see the unessential. And then the next one is that, we should supposed to regard essential as essential. So I was wondering, how does that reflect in our practice or daily life?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked the question. When I met Bob at the retreat that he was at, he asked the same question. So I don't mean to put you on the spot, Bob, but do you remember what I said?
I don't remember it well enough to say it, so I'd prefer that you say it.
Yeah. So the sutta is, can you say that again, in the essential?
Yeah. So the first one is, in the unessential, we imagine the essential. In the essential, we see the unessential. Anyone who entertains such wrong thoughts never will realize the truth.
Yeah. So the first one is pretty straightforward, which is, in the unessential, we see the essential, which is to say that take out whatever is not Dhamma, take out whatever doesn't seem to be reflective of the Four Noble Truths, take out whatever doesn't seem to be reflective of the Eightfold Path. In the unessential, those kinds of things can be where you're dealing with some kind of stressful situation. It could be where you're dealing with stressful people around you. It could be distractions, hindrances, things like that. See those for what they are, and let go of your unwholesome reactions to them, and see the Dhamma of that moment. The Dhamma meaning the reality of that moment, the truth of that moment, which is that this is out of your control, that this is an impermanent situation or circumstance, and use the 6 R's to let those go. Now, in seeing the unessential in the essential, that's a little more subtle. And what that's talking about is once you get to that place where you have the Dhamma, once you get to that place where you have an understanding of dependent origination, where you start to experience the jhanas, where you start to really feel good with the loving kindness, where you start to experience other Brahma Viharas, where you start to have insights and you start to really get an understanding of the Dhamma, then the unessential there is the conceit related to that. So, Bhante always likes to say, it's an interesting way of saying it. He says, don't make a big deal out of things, which means, yes, it's wonderful, that you attain this jhana, or it's wonderful that you have this insight, but don't allow the mind to identify with it. Don't allow the mind to become attached to it and see it as being part of the raft. The simile of the raft is that where the Dhamma being the raft, it takes you from one shore to the far shore, to Nibbana. But then once you have gotten there, you don't carry the raft on with you while walking towards wherever your destination is. So in the same way, when you do experience something wonderful, it's a good thing. It's definitely a wonderful thing to be able to see the letting go of hindrances. It's a wonderful thing to see the experience of jhanas and so on. But if you allow the mind to get attached to these things, then there can happen to be situations where the mind doesn't move forward. One example is there's a certain point where the experience of the loving kindness will start to move to your head, if for beginners. And the advice there, the suggestion there is not to allow that loving kindness to be pushed down, or rather don't push down the loving kindness, allow it to be there wherever it might be. So what you're seeing with yourself, or what you're seeing in your mind, is all of these processes are impersonal. Even your intention to send out loving kindness, even your intention to send out the compassion, or whatever it might be, all of that is still impersonal. So the experience of the jhanas, the experience of the levels of cessation in each jhana, where in the second jhana you start to let go of verbalizing, and in the fourth jhana you start to tranquilize the body, meaning the breath becomes almost imperceptible, and so on. All of that is a natural process. The moment you try to push it, the moment you try too hard, you are basically looking at the unessential in the essential. The essential here being looking at it as a natural process, not allowing the mind to attach to it. So letting go of the unessential in the essential is the process of not identifying with whatever progress that is happening, seeing it all as being just a natural process of the path and the practice.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, Delphine, may I have a question?
Yes.
Ask.
Go ahead.
I wonder if radiating of love and compassion can initiate restlessness and agitation in other people who you try to radiate that feeling. Because I've seen during my meditation, then if I'm watching the mind and then try to feel or feel compassion and love, hindrances could come. And can it make some influence to other people? Can it influence other people?
Yes, it can. It absolutely can. But you have to understand that even when you're sending out loving kindness, even when you're sending out compassion, you're not responsible for how that person reacts. So if a person is restless, if a person is agitated, if a person is whatever it might be, all you can do is you can send out loving kindness, you can send out compassion to them, and it could be that they can feel it, They can absolutely feel it, but maybe they choose not to respond to it in that way. You know, the way you can practically understand how loving kindness or compassion affects other people beyond the scope of just radiating out to them is you can notice how you speak with them. You can notice how your words are infused with loving kindness, or you can notice how your words are infused with compassion, and those words will help them to relax. Those words will help them to tranquilize and become calmer. So that's a practical effect of having loving kindness or radiating loving kindness to them. There's a wonderful sutta in which the Buddha talks about in the simile of the saw. I think that's Majjhima Nikaya 21 still.
Yes.
Yeah, 21. And in there, the Buddha says that, you know, others might speak to you in a timely manner or an untimely manner. Others might speak to you harshly or softly. They might speak truth or untruth. They might speak in a way that is conducive to your good mental health or not conducive. They might speak with kindness or not with kindness. But regardless of how they speak or how they respond, it should be seen as a reminder to continue to radiate loving kindness to them. So that's a wonderful sutta to check out in your own time, because it really gives you clarity on, regardless of how a person is, whether they're happy or sad, whether they're angry or, you know, elated or whatever it might be, keep sending loving kindness to them, because that translates into your words, of course your thoughts, but your words and your actions being in conjunction or being in alignment with loving kindness. So that means that you are following what is known as right intention. When we say right intention, we're talking about three components here. We're talking about letting go of anything that causes us to have attachments or aversion, and having non-ill will, which is loving kindness, and non-cruelty, which is compassion. So yes, in short, the short answer is people can feel it, but how they choose to respond to it is up to them. That's their karma.
Thank you.
Delson,
Yes.
I have another question.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a daily practice or practical out in the real daily life question. So I have a very unique practice arena in the fact that, you know, that I have a restaurant and I have a patio in front of the restaurant. And there's two situations that frequently arise on the patio. One is where, because I'm centrally located in the city, where homeless people will come and sit on the patio. And, you know, more often than not, the homeless people are mentally ill. So they're very challenging to deal with. But it's my responsibility in order to kind of, you know, protect the other customers that are out on the patio, or to make sure that there's seating available for the customers that want to sit out on the patio, to go out and extricate those homeless people from the patio. And on one, and while I feel a lot of compassion for them in their situation, I have to ask them to leave. And sometimes they get angry at me when I ask them to do that. So that's the first condition that offers a great opportunity for my practice. The second condition is I'm next door to a children's emergency clinic, a medical clinic that doesn't have a waiting area inside it. So the patients that come to the clinic are asked to wait into their car until they text them on the phone to come inside. But frequently, because the child is sick, they don't want to go sit back in the car. So what they'll do is come with their sick child and sit on the table on my patio. And again, I'm in a situation, and the child may have COVID or something serious, you know. And again, it's my responsibility to ask them to not sit on that table. Again, it's a great opportunity for practice, because I have children and I feel horrible that they're dealing with their sick child. And sometimes the child is crying or whatever, you know, But because it's my responsibility to make sure that those tables are free for the customers, I have to go ask those people to leave. And, sometimes I just avoid it because I don't want to have any interaction with them because I just feel like it's too much. But anyway, those are those two situations that I was just going to get your thoughts on.
I think what you're doing is correct. Because first and foremost, you are one of the proprietors of the business, and you're not doing something that is instigating them or causing them further pain or suffering. You're just requesting them in a loving and kind manner. Hopefully, I'm sure you are. You can't sit here because we have customers. So could you please, for the homeless people, could you please find another space? Or for people who are in there, can you ask them, you can just say, can you please go to your car and wait? Because there are customers here wanting to eat. I think what you're doing is correct, as long as it's in a loving and kind manner.
Okay. And like in your the video today where you were talking about respond versus react, and I think I've gotten a lot more clarification on wholesome versus unwholesome in that context. But essentially what I was kind of thinking is when you're talking about wholesome, it's basically I'm keeping my awareness on the wholesome, on the feeling of loving kindness. And when it drifts away from that, that's when I'm veering into the unwholesome. Is that a good way to think of it?
Yes, that is a good way to think of it. And what I would add to that, if it's not already in the video, if I haven't talked about this before, I'll just say it again. How do you recognize what is wholesome and how do you recognize what is unwholesome? The way you recognize it is if your intention is unwholesome, you are going to feel some kind of tense or tightness in the body or in the mind. You're going to feel an unease, a sense of unease when there's an intention that is unwholesome. But when you are wholesome, when your intention is wholesome, you feel clear, you feel open, the mind feels pure and at ease. And so anytime there is this sense of unease in whatever it is you're doing, know that to be the unwholesome. Anytime there is an intention to be wholesome, know that it is because the mind is, or it is wholesome. And the sign of that is because the mind is pure and relaxed and so on. So the unwholesome will indicate some kind of craving arising, will indicate some kind of identification arising. Whereas the wholesome, like loving kindness, if it's done in the proper manner, will be something that is spacious in the mind, will be something that creates some level of clarity in the mind, some level of stronger mindfulness.
Thank you.
I have a question, please.
Yes. Yes.
Hi, Delson.
Hello.
I just wonder when you say that do not identify with whatever good we experience in the meditation. What if I'm curious and really want to make sense, like what I'm experiencing, and I don't have a teacher around to ask for that experience. And when I look at the sutta, I still don't understand whether that's what the sutta say or it's just my misunderstanding. And I experience that, and it's make me feel really painful to feel proud of it, and then later on realize it's just conceit, and then it's actually make my meditation progress kind of it stopped my progress, and I couldn't meditate anymore because I just restlessness and want to find out what it is. And I just wonder how should I in the future, how should I just really stop enduring that pain and just go on with the meditation and be in equanimity with it. Thank you.
Yeah. So a couple of things there. Number one, I want to explain to you that there's nothing wrong with having an opportunity to be happy that you're experiencing a state that is positive and wholesome and in alignment with the Dhamma. My clarification should be here is that don't attach to it in the sense of don't allow that to be something that your mind just rests on. Continue on. So in the same way that you would see an unpleasant feeling and you see it in your sixth art, let that go and then continue on. In the same way, when there is a pleasant feeling, you acknowledge it and you say, okay, that's great. The moment you start to notice that the mind starts to create that conceit, starts to create all of this ideas of, this is wonderful and I want to stay here, and, there's a sense of pride in it. Let that go. 6R it and continue on. You don't have to endure the pain. You don't have to endure it. This isn't a practice in which you have to sit through the pain in a way that causes you further suffering, because that's only going to create more further painful feelings. And you notice it, you notice the painful feeling, you notice the reaction to that painful feeling, and you 6R it. So you're not 6Ring away the pain, you're 6Ring away your reaction to the pain. You're 6Ring away the reaction to the pleasant feeling. You're acknowledging the reality of the situation. The Dhamma of that moment is something is painful or something is pleasant. But the moment the mind holds on to it, rather than just allowing the flow to arise, letting the mind just continue on and seeing that as being part of that process, rather than that happening, what happens is then there's further tension, there's further tightness, there's further craving, there's further identification. So when you recognize that and you see that, then let that go. Use the 6R process to let that go.
Yeah, I just wonder if it's the habit energy like Anusaya, to identify with the good thing in life. It's like it's our conceit. Ego is so huge. How can we slowly drop that habit? Just in our daily life, do we just seek R every time it arises?
Yeah. So yeah, you're talking about the anusayas. When we talk about the anusayas, in a pleasant feeling, there can be something like the underlying tendency to attach to it. And in a painful feeling, you'll see an underlying tendency to push it away. Or there's in all of the three cases, whether it's pleasant, painful, or neutral, there's a sense of identifying with it, and there can be that conceit. So how do you notice that that's happening? You notice it when the mind starts to tense up. When you notice that, then you recognize and you 6R. What the whole point of this whole process of the 6Rs is to recondition the mind. So every time you do the 6Rs, you're doing a few things. Number one, you are fulfilling the 4 right efforts. You're doing right effort. Number two, you are following the Eightfold Path. Number 3, you are understanding the situation as it really is, which means that you are cultivating the understanding of the Four Noble Truths. There is present in this conceit, you notice that, which is the recognizing. You take your awareness away from that, put it towards relaxing the mind and body, coming back to the smile, and then coming back to a mind that is wholesome, whether that's radiating loving kindness or being with your spiritual friend or whatever the case might be. Every time you do it, you are further reconditioning your mind. So it is a process. It seems like it's effortful in the beginning. It seems like it's going to take some effort because it's something new, possibly, or it's something you have to continue to do until it no longer feels like an effort. And what I mean by that is, in the beginning stages, when you notice the conceit, the mind might just continue on going with it, and then you forget your 6R. But the moment you notice it, that notice part of it, that noting or noticing part of that is the first step of the 6Rs. That is the recognized step. Once you recognize, then you do the rest of the 6Rs in a wave. You roll them. You just release it, relax, re-smile, and then return. And what you're going to notice is every time you do that, yes, the conceit might come up, but it won't be as strong as before. If you've been successfully and properly applying the 6Rs, then what you're going to notice is that the hindrance is not as strong the next time it arises, and eventually it'll fade away whenever it will fade away. The point here is not to allow the mind to get attached to it, not to get aversive towards it, and so on. And just so you understand, whenever you do the 6 R's, you're also reconditioning the formations. Those are the very roots of, in terms of how you see the world. They are the influencers of how you take this world and how you understand this world, and how there might be craving or there might not be craving. There might be conceit or might not be conceit. If the formations are fettered by conceit and they give rise to a certain kind of experience in which you hold on to it, there's an underlying tendency where the mind holds on to that experience and that feeling. Whenever you decide to relax it, whenever you decide to let go of it, then you are weakening those formations that cause the mind to react in that way. And you're strengthening the formations that allow you to continue to be mindful of it and to continue to let go of it. So in short, yes, it is about continuing to do the 6 R's. But with the understanding that I've given you, it'll help you to understand the importance and hopefully motivate you to see it over and over and over until you see the weakening of conceit in every moment.
Delson, I have a question about factors of awakening, especially the one that's investigation or discernment, as some people like to call it that way. I wonder that during the meditation, if like, because that's one of the things to be balanced with, but I'm not quite sure what that is, because it feels like it's involving thinking, but while we're in a deeper state and we're like, we're not supposed to think. And or when there are other times when I feel, okay, I'm sitting in and all of a sudden I thought about something about Dharma, like say, all of a sudden, like say, if there's a thought about, this is not me, this is not this is not myself, pop up, should I just release it, just like a regular distraction, or I don't know what, like if there's a better way to think about that.
Yeah. Well, when you get this kind of understanding of this is not me, this is not mine, this is not myself, see it as an insight and let it be and let it go. Meaning you don't need to hold on to that insight. It's just something that arose as a result of seeing the truth of the matter or of the moment. Investigation of states, I tend not to use that kind of translation because it implies within that meaning that there's some kind of analysis going on, some kind of, application of reflection going on. But the way I've translated Dhamma which is that particular enlightenment factor, is just understanding. And that understanding can be nonverbal as well. When you get into the higher jhanas, there's not any verbalizing going on, but you still know on the mental level that there is loving kindness present. You know on the mental level that there is a quiet mind present, or whatever it might be. Or when this insight arises of this is not me, this is not mine, this is not myself, it might be verbal and it might not be verbal, but regardless, it is a form of understanding the truth of that moment. And insofar as that's all you have to do. So when you have mindfulness, dependent upon that mindfulness, there is a knowing, there is a cognizing, there is an understanding of what is going on, whether their mind is in a wholesome state of mind or whether the mind is in a unwholesome state of mind. When you know where it is, that is enough in the case of investigation of states. Anything beyond that will start to tend towards or incline towards analysis. And then when you go into that form of analysis, then the mind is no longer really in a process of mindfulness or meditation.
So this is that, in other words, you cannot intentionally bring up some kind of thought like that. It's just like naturally occurring.
It's naturally occurring. And then, for example, if you get into quiet mind, there comes a point where the mind starts to either deviate towards sloth and torpor or restlessness. And depending on the situation, you are using to an extent that discernment, but that discernment is like how we have feeling and perception. Here, feeling is likened to mindfulness, which is the the knowing of an experience or the sensing of the experience. And perception is the recognizing or understanding or labeling of what that experience is. So for example, when I talk about feeling, you know that there's sound, that is the feeling, but you're recognizing that as a voice, my voice entering the ears. Or when you see the color red, there's the feeling of the color, but the labeling of that color being red is the perception. In the same way, mindfulness is the bare awareness or attention of what is happening. And then the knowing aspect of it, the cognizing aspect of it, is that investigation of states. It's the perceiving of what exactly is the quality of mind in that moment. So that happens automatically, so to speak. When there's mindfulness, followed by that mindfulness, there will be that discernment of this is what it is. And to that extent, then you can play around with it in the sense that it gives you information that the mind is, let's say, too restless or in sloth and torpor, and then accordingly, then you make adjustments. So for example, so you have mindfulness and you recognize that the mind is feeling sloth and torpor. That mindfulness of sloth and torpor, and then is the mindfulness, is the first link of mind, the first factor of mindfulness. The recognizing that there is sloth and torpor, that what that hindrance is sloth and torpor, is the investigation of states factor. That's the Dhammavichaya. Then accordingly, you adjust by putting in a little bit more interest, putting a little bit more attention, putting a little bit more joy to balance out that sloth and torpor. So very simply put, Dhammavichaya shouldn't go beyond just the knowing and the cognizing and perceiving of what state the mind is in.
Okay, thank you very much. It helps.
Maybe to add that the tweaking of the enlightenment factors is not something for the beginning practice. It's really for in the very high states of the mind that one can slightly balance them out. So when you are doing spiritual friend or something, then probably it's not really useful to start thinking about the enlightenment factors.
Right. Yeah, it's a good point, because actually, even when you're doing the spiritual friend, the enlightenment factors are coming into balance quite naturally, quite automatically. There's not much effort you have to make there. Like you go back to the discernment, you are discerning that you are on your object of meditation or you're not on your object of meditation. So whenever you recognize, you're actually using mindfulness and you're using discernment to see if the mind is collected or not collected. And that's the limit of that investigation. Anything beyond that is, as I said, analysis paralysis.
Can I have one more question, please?
Yes.
When
Yes.
when we do the metta meditation, and when I get to the point where I feel so calm, and then the feeling of metta is still there, but then the feeling, the sensation of the body, like heartbeat or breathing, is become stronger, and then my mind just naturally go to that body sensation. Should I keep going on with metta? Should I bring it back to metta, or should I just flow with the flow and go to the body sensation feeling and focus on that?
No, you should stay with the metta. So if you start to notice that the mind starts to go towards the breath or goes to the heartbeat or things like that, see those as distractions and use the 6 R's and return to the metta. Your object of meditation here is always going to be metta until it changes when whatever might happen later on. Yes, it's good that you're feeling the calm. It's good that you're feeling the clarity. But the moment you feel that and the mind starts to deviate towards that, the whole point here is even not to deviate so much that you look at the jhana factors. It's just when you start to notice that there's a lot of joy, or you start to notice there's a lot of calmness, okay, good, that's great. But the moment the mind uses that as an object, it has gotten distracted and is no longer using metta as the object. So when you do that, just recognize it, 6R it, and then come back to the metta, come back to the feeling of it.
Hey, Delson, I have another practical question.
Yeah.
It's really just, and I think actually Sil asked this question in the video, but I couldn't really understand your answer. And it was, she asked that question about falling back asleep at night, because I was kind of excited about this morning. And so I was waking up last night, and I want to go back to sleep. And I kind of used to do the same thing that she did, where I would use Vipassana and note my rising and falling or something of my abdomen. And I think my mind would just get bored and I'd fall asleep. But you gave some kind of other advice in terms of during, what's the better practice in terms of calming the mind and falling back asleep?
Okay. I think I recall that. Yeah, I mean, so basically, you mean you get up and then you want to go back to sleep? Is that what you're saying?
Kind of, yeah. Like if I set my alarm to wake up at 5:30 to meditate, and then for whatever reason, I wake up at 3 a.m., and I'm checking. It's not 5:30, it's 3, but then my mind is already racing. And now I'm thinking, okay, I've only got 2 hours to sleep. It's like, how do I get myself back into a mode of falling asleep? That's what I mean,
You know what Bhante would say?
Get up and meditate.
Yes.
Okay.
No, I mean, if you can do it, I mean, if the mind is active, if the mind is, if it's awake, if there's no sleepiness, and you just woke up and there's, then it might be a good opportunity to kind of just meditate, maybe even if it's for half an hour or for an hour. And then if mind feels like it wants to go back to sleep, then go to sleep. But if you feel like, you do want to go to sleep and you woke up and you want to go to sleep, then I would use the tranquility factors. I would use the metta, or even just equanimity, because equanimity is a lot more or a lot less energetic. It's more stable, more balanced, and then just tranquilize, and you will probably fall asleep. It's your choice. You can either sit up and do some meditation, or you can, decide to just tranquilize the mind and go back to sleep.
All right.
And if it's at 3 o'clock, it's only 2.5 hours.
Well, I'm getting over my illness, so that's why I feel like I need to sleep.
Oh yeah. No, yes, definitely. You definitely want to catch up on your sleep.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
This night when I meditate and watching the mind, it was like a dissociation between the viewer and the mind. And when in the mind arose some thoughts, it was not seen like, it was not my thoughts, it was thoughts of the mind. And at the moment there was no any possibility to secure these thoughts or something like this, because I think I was as a watcher, or it was a watch, it was an observer, and there were no any consciousness in the observer actually, and I could secure maybe the situation only after I went out of the state. Or Seal previously said that if you are on the object of meditation, you shouldn't do 6R because it's not useful maybe. How can I help myself in this situation?
Yeah. Okay. So first you have to understand, where you are at, wherever you are at, where the mind is watching mind, meaning there's a certain level of metacognition, as it's known, which is, you don't become the meditator. You're just letting the mind watch itself. really. That's all that's happening. That's okay. U6R only if you see that the mind starts to deviate away from, not even starts to deviate. Let me clarify. It's only like you might notice certain thoughts that might be there in the background, but you're also noticing that the mind is still with the loving kindness. The mind is still with its object of meditation, whatever it might be. Then you don't have to do anything. Those thoughts, because there's no fuel of attention, will dissipate. There won't be any need to 6R. But the moment you see that the mind has now deviated and is no longer aware of the object of meditation, no longer aware of the loving kindness, and is starting to drift into another line of thought and different thought processes, and you recognize that, then you do the rest of the 6Rs to come back to your object.
But the thing is that during the station, the object of the meditation object was my mind, actually. And what can I do? Because I'm watching the mind, and the mind is thinking some thoughts, and I couldn't do anything actually in the situation.
So wait, so your object of meditation is quiet mind? Is that right? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, but it was not quite actually. Quiet actually.
That's okay. That's okay. I mean, if it's just mind watching mind, and you start to notice different thoughts, you come to a point where you're just relaxing and releasing. You're releasing and relaxing. You're just coming back to the awareness of the mind. Don't worry about the other kinds of thoughts around. If you start to notice that the mind becomes distracted because of those kinds of thoughts, that's when you just release and relax and come back to mind. So if you're at that level of quiet mind, if you're at that level where you're just staying in what is known as neither perception or non-perception, then those little thoughts that come up are like proto-perceptions. They're like little formations that arise and give rise to some kind of an experience in the mental realm, but they're not fully formed. So if you just allow the mind to stay with its quiet, the mind, then eventually it will become quiet. But if you become distracted by it, then the attention that goes towards that distraction will continue to fuel it. And so that's when you relax and you relax it away and you come back to your object, which is the mind itself. Eventually, if the mind has that patience, all of those proto thoughts, all of those different little things that are happening in terms of mental activity will start to soften and will eventually just die down and become silent, and you will be with quiet mind. It just needs a little bit more. You just need a little bit more time for that mind to quiet down. It can happen in 5 minutes. It can happen in 10 minutes. It can happen in an hour. As long as you don't get distracted from mind watching mind, as long as you're staying with mind, as long as mind is staying with itself, you're okay. There's nothing else to do. When you see that the mind becomes distracted, then you relax, you come back.
Okay, thank you.
Can I have one more question?
Yeah.
With the metta meditation, I never sit more than 1 hour, and it's always a structure, starting with myself, and then loved one, and then with own sentient being. And I'm just curious, after that structure finished, do I come back to myself, or do I just continue on with sending metta out to every sentient being, like for a longer time? Because I want to try a longer time.
Are you radiating to the 6 directions? Is that your object right now, or are you doing spiritual friend? Spiritual friend, I think, right? So
I always follow Bhante Bodhi method, so it's always
okay.
Yeah.
So do you want to take this one?
Yes, you're
don't know.
just starting out with the 6 R's. So your object is only one spiritual friend. And you pick
Okay.
one person. All the time it's the same person. It's someone that is alive. and that you don't experience any lust towards. So for instance, maybe the same gender, and it's not a family member, because then you might get distracted by some argument you had some time ago, and then you get distracted. So you pick one spiritual friend. Radiating to all sentient beings is much later, when you progress in the meditation. So we can go through those instructions when you get there.
Yeah. So just to add to that, what you want to do is the first 10 minutes you send out, or you keep the loving kindness in your heart and you send it to yourself for about 10 minutes, or whenever the mind feels like, then it starts to go to its spiritual friend. And you can imagine the spiritual friend in front of you, you're sending it out to them, or you can keep the spiritual friend in your heart and allow them to be in that loving kindness. But for that half an hour, for that 1 hour, all you're doing is staying with the spiritual friend. There will come a point where, as still said, that you will start radiating to different people in your life, and then eventually to all sentient beings. But that is at a later stage. For now, at least for the next 1 or 2 days, see how things go when you're using the 6 R's. See how things go when you're staying with yourself for the first 10 minutes, and then the spiritual friend for the rest of the meditation. And then Sil will guide you further in terms of whether you're ready to go move on to the next step.
Doesn't I like listen to one of your like Q&A sessions about, like, you talk about consciousness, and I know the question was, is consciousness is one way and the linear, and you talk about it's like a feedback loop and all that. So I do have a question in regards to deep hallucination about the bhava. The habitual tendency. I was just curious, is that habitual tendency, is that something that we kind of accumulated throughout this life, or is this kind of like come with the consciousness, so it's kind of from many different lives as well?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's from many different lives as well. So bhava is like the storehouse or the library of different kinds of inclinations and reactions that the mind has. So, the way that you see a certain kind of person, like you have certain ideas about that person, preconceived notions. This is the storehouse of those. When people have some kind of bigoted thoughts and things like that, that's the bhava, because they have certain kinds of ideas of how certain people are, or certain types of beings are, and so on. And so the accumulation of these different kinds of tendencies is that process of bhava. And it can be that it is a storehouse for different kinds of inclinations from many, 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 many lifetimes ago. There was a story about, Bhante was talking about it, since it came up at a certain conversation. He was talking about this, of all people, an arahat who used to call other people around him of a low class, because at that time in ancient India, you had the caste system, and there was a high caste of the Brahmins, and there was a low caste of other people and things like that. And even though he didn't mean anything by it, he didn't have any kind of, ill will or any kind of idea that he was superior and things like that. It was just a tendency of, calling people low caste. And the Buddha said that this being, this monk, has been a Brahmin for at least 500 lifetimes. So the inclination for that, it continues on. Now, that's not to say that I have to clarify that. That's not to say that arahats have bhava in the sense of becoming. But there will be still a personality based on previous preferences, based on previous inclinations. The only difference is there won't be any more identification with it. So you might do something, or people might do something which they have no reason for thinking, why are they doing it? It doesn't seem to be from this lifetime. And it's quite possible that it's because of a previous lifetime. The idea of, for example, fear of the water, that could happen because the person experienced drowning in a previous lifetime. Fear of fire, or fear of heights, or whatever those things might be. These are all different tendencies of the person, or the tendencies of the sense of self. And it's adbhava where those tendencies become accumulated into this concrete sense of self, from which then a person acts. And that when that person acts from there, that's the birth, that's the link of birth. So every time you recognize, or you're able to see that there's a tendency that the mind is acting from, it's almost like really an automatic tendency, without thinking, without reflection, without mindfulness. That is a process of bhava. But when you recognize it and you let go of it, you're actually reconditioning the bhava. And the bhava is really a very interesting thing, because we talk about, since you mentioned the linear process of dependent origination and the feedback loops, it's really at bhava where a lot of the feedback loops happen. From bhava, you have the feedback loop to formations, you have the feedback loop to consciousness, you have the feedback loop to feeling, and so on and so forth. And even to the taints, like the asavas, to the taint of being, is strengthened every time you act from a certain kind of tendency, because that just continues to accumulate and strengthen.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I just thought about another question. Maybe I don't have a full understanding about this. Is about, I was thinking about the rebirth process. Like in the beginning, there's this consciousness like exists, and then the karma carries it, and the rebirth happened. So I was wondering, where is that consciousness coming from?
Okay, so for example, let's take just the example of one lifetime and the other, and it's just going to be one human lifetime to the next human lifetime. Now, let's say that that human has been very wholesome, very generous, very giving, keeping the precepts, and always being selfless, having loving kindness, having compassion, and so on. If that person's inclinations have always been that way throughout their life, then there's a tendency for those formations that are rooted in those wholesome intentions to come up again and again and again. So what we're saying here is, in every given moment, there is an inclination towards the wholesome or the unwholesome, dependent upon previous choices. And if previous choices have always been primarily wholesome, then the inclination automates towards the wholesome choice in that next given moment. So in the same way, when a person passes away, there is what can be known as these formations that arise at the very last moment. And they might have a very pleasant feeling because of those formations. So they might look back on their lives and they see all the wonderful things they did, the acts of generosity they had, the acts of kindness that they had. Because of that, it creates, or it gives rise to a consciousness. So when we see in the links of dependent origination how formations condition consciousness, it's because they activate a consciousness, a type of consciousness. So when there is any kind of identification with that series of formations that arise at the point of death, that gives rise to a consciousness. That consciousness then transfers all of that karma into a new namarupa. And that namarupa is dependent upon that previous karma. So once that consciousness descends into the new namarupa, it dissipates. This is what's known as the evolving consciousness, or known as the rebirth consciousness, or the rebirth linking consciousness. But once it does its job of transferring that karma into a new namarupa, transferring all the formations and so on into the new namarupa, it fades away, it passes. And now that there's life, another consciousness arises and passes away in every moment. So when that new consciousness arises based on those formations, it's in a split second. It's not like it takes a certain amount of time for that consciousness to arise and then come into a new namarupa and then dissipate. It happens insofar as when we snap our finger and there's 100,000 arising and passing away of your consciousness, it's the same way. That's what's known as spontaneous birth. There's the idea of spontaneous generation, which happens in the Deva realms, the Brahma realms, the hell realms, and the Hungry Ghost realms. But then there's spontaneous birth in the sense that there's no antarbhava in Pali, what is known as an interval period where the consciousness is waiting for a namarupa. It just arises based on the reactions in that old life just before the death, and then goes into a new namarupa in the next moment, and then dissipates once life is there in that new namarupa.
Thank you.
Any last questions?
One more question. End of the previous retreat with Bante said that I should start with radiating equanimity and then watching the mind. Should I start watching mind when I in the fourth jhana, or can I start it earlier? Actually, start watching the mind, and should I have love and kindness, or compassion, or equanimity when I am watching the mind in lower jhanas?
Sil, do you want to take this?
First of all, don't pay attention to which jhana you are in, because that would be a distraction. When you radiate equanimity, there will be a certain moment where you just can't radiate anymore, and it just stops. And you might try again to radiate, but you might even get a headache or feel some tension. And that is the sign that that mind is ready to watch itself. So you just let go of the radiating, and you just start watching the mind. But the mind decides how fast you go through all these processes. For instance, if you would start with metta, the mind decides to do metta for a certain amount of time, and then switches to compassion, and maybe to joy, or skips joy and jumps to equanimity. And then you stop radiating at a certain point, and then you start watching the mind. So I would say that the mind decides which Brahma Vihara gets to be radiated, and if it can't radiate anymore, it watches itself.
Thank you.
Yeah, to add to that, and just to add to that, I mean, it might be that you might if the mind feels like it wants to radiate loving kindness for a couple of minutes, and then it just stops. That's fine too. You can just radiate in one direction, and it just stops, and the mind is now watching mind. So wherever the mind feels like it wants to go in the way of the Brahma Viharas, allow that, as Sil said. And then eventually you just get to quiet mind. So, sometimes Bhante will say, just radiate 2 minutes in each direction, one of the Brahma Viharas, maybe equanimity. But sometimes the mind feels like it just wants to be in compassion for like a few minutes. Let that happen, and it will get to quiet mind. Your ultimate destination, I mean, that's the ultimate pit stop, is the quiet mind and then nibbana. But whatever it is leading towards that is whatever it's going to be. So it might take 5 minutes, it might take 10 minutes, but whatever it might be, just start wherever the mind feels like.
Thank you.
Okay,
Okay.
let's share some merit. Yeah.
Yes. May suffering ones be suffering free, and the fear-struck fearless be. May the grieving shadow grieve, and may all beings find relief. May all beings share this merit that we have thus acquired for the acquisition of all kinds of happiness. May beings inhabiting space and earth, devas and nagas of mighty power, share this merit of ours. May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.